What if Miyamoto Musashi fought Richard the Lionheart? Miyamoto Musashi and Richard the Lionheart meet not as legends, but as living embodiments of two incompatible fighting systems. And the very first seconds reveal that this duel is not about who is stronger, but about whose logic survives longer. Richard comes into battle, heavy and dominant, his figure covered in chainmail and plates, his weight distributed in such a way as to withstand a blow and respond with an even more powerful one. The long knightly sword is held confidently. The center of gravity of the blade is shifted forward. Each swing is an attempt to force contact and break the enemy through kinetic energy, while Musashi stands differently. The katana is held not as an instrument of force, but as an instrument of distance control. The body is relaxed, knees soft, shoulders are lowered. His gaze is not fixed on Richard's blade, because the blade is the effect, not the cause. He watches the shoulders, hips, and feet, because they are the ones that give away the intention a split second before the strike. The initial approaches are cautious. Richard steps forward, closing the gap, testing his reactions. His movements are linear, directed straight ahead, closing the distance as on a battlefield, where pressure and mass decide the outcome. Musashi responds with minimal shifts, half a step back, half a step to the side, diagonal trajectories that keep him within the zone of control, where a katana is still deadly, but a European sword is already losing speed and accuracy. The physics of combat begin to emerge very quickly. Each of Richard's strikes requires acceleration. The inertia of the heavy blade and armor creates a delay between the intent and the follow-through. And Musashi uses this not to dodge at the last second, but to escape early, forcing his strikes to land at critically close range, where they appear dangerous, but in fact miss their target. With each such miss, Richard expends energy, while Musashi wastes almost nothing. After a few exchanges, a difference in breathing becomes noticeable. The knight breathes deeper, his chest rises faster, his muscles tense, while Musashi's breathing remains even, because his style is built on economy of movement, not maximum effort. Richard changes his approach, shortening his range, beginning to use thrusts and body pressure, trying to turn the fight into a clinch, where his mass and defense will provide a decisive advantage. At these moments, the fight becomes truly deadly, because one direct contact and Musashi's light defense will not save him. But the samurai doesn't block or absorb the blow. His blade slides, changing the angle of attack, not meeting the sword directly, but redirecting its trajectory. Here, the key difference in their philosophies emerges. Richard tries to control his opponent through contact, Musashi through space. Every step the knight takes forward narrows his options for escape. Every lateral shift Musashi makes expands his own field, and gradually, the fight begins to resemble a geometric puzzle, where one moves in straight lines and the other in arcs and angles. At some point, Richard realizes that the fight is dragging on, and does what made him a legend on the battlefield. He accelerates, putting his entire body into a series of powerful attacks, the blade describing wide arcs capable of breaking through defenses and ending the duel in a single blow. And it is here that Musashi first demonstrates the full depth of his approach, introducing his second hand, the wakizashi, coming out not to strike, but to control, a short movement that disrupts the trajectory of the greatsword just enough to miss a vital area. It's not a wound, not a decisive moment, but a psychological turning point. For the first time, Richard feels that his strength doesn't dictate the outcome, but rather that his own movements are being used against him. From this point on, the fight begins to work against the knight on a psychological level. Every blow becomes a gamble, every miss a loss, while Musashi continues to accumulate an advantage, taking no unnecessary risks, allowing fatigue, micro delays in reaction, and tension to do their work. By the middle of the duel, it becomes clear that Richard is still mortally dangerous, but he is forced to force the fight, while Musashi accepts it only on his terms. The outcome begins to shape not a single decisive moment, but a chain of small, almost imperceptible advantages, where time, distance, and control work against the heavy warrior, turning power into a burden and patience into a weapon. Where rage and pressure break the line, and resistance is extinguished by fear of the next blow. But here, before him, there is no line or soldiers, but a man who does not retreat psychologically even an inch, and this begins to affect Richard more than any wound. Each time the knight's sword roars through the air and fails to find its target, the space seems to contract against the attacker. Because Musashi does not disappear, does not run away, and does not defend himself in the usual way, he constantly remains at the edge of reach, forcing his opponent to constantly make a decision, constantly expend attention and energy, and this turns the duel into a cognitive trap. Richard tries to break this pattern, abruptly changing the tempo, making false moves, provoking a response. But Musashi does not fall for the feints. His reaction is delayed just enough to not be a reaction at all, but an action of his own initiative. And herein lies the key difference. The knight responds, the samurai asks. During one of the close encounters, Richard's blade does catch the edge of his kimono, tearing the fabric and leaving a shallow cut. This moment could have been a turning point in any other fight, but Musashi doesn't accelerate or retaliate. He accepts the damage as part of the process, while Richard perceives it as a signal that the pressure is finally starting to work. It is here that he makes a strategic error, increasing the pressure instead of stabilizing the pace. The next series of strikes becomes heavier, wider, less economical, and although each one is still deadly, there are micro pauses between them that a trained eye uses not to attack, but to reposition itself. Musashi begins to shift so that the sun is behind him, and Richard's shadow betrays the beginning of each movement, even before the muscles activate the blade. The battlefield gradually ceases to be neutral. It begins to work for the one who reads it best, and the samurai reads it like a text, where every line is a corner, every pause a breath, and every step a choice between life and death. By this point, it becomes clear that the duel is far from over, but its vector has already been set. Richard is still capable of ending the fight with a single blow, but the cost of that blow increases with each passing minute. Musashi, meanwhile, doesn't seek an immediate end. He methodically brings his opponent to a point where even the power of a king and a crusader begins to work against him. The dynamic shifts not abruptly, but almost imperceptibly. And this is precisely what makes it all the more dangerous. Because Richard continues to fight, as if the fight can still be won in a single burst, while Musashi is already leading him to an inevitable outcome, gradually narrowing the permissible options. The knight's movements become slightly more straightforward, not due to a loss of skill, but due to accumulated fatigue, because the heavy armor that gave him confidence at the beginning now turns into an additional burden. His breathing becomes ragged, his body begins to work with a delay, and each swing requires not only strength, but also will. While Musashi remains economical, his strides almost uniform in length and rhythm, as if the fight has locked into a repeating cycle in which the samurai feels himself the master. Richard tries to force a decisive moment, sharply closing the distance, taking a risky approach, trying to pin Musashi to a straight line and deprive him of maneuver. For a moment, it works. The blades meet closely, metal grinding, the distance between the bodies minimal, and here, the difference in weight and strength is felt most strongly. However, it is precisely in this range that Musashi feels most confident, because his technique does not require a sweeping movement. Short movements of the wrist and forearm allow him to work in areas where a long knightly sword would begin to hinder its wielder. One of these moments almost proves fatal for both. Richard delivers a slashing blow from above, putting the rest of his strength into it. Musashi does not retreat, but shifts inside the trajectory, the katana passing centimeters from the helmet, the wakizashi cutting along the unprotected part of the arm, shallowly, but enough for the fingers to momentarily lose feeling. And this moment is enough for Richard to retreat for the first time, not according to plan, but instinctively. It's not a defeat or a wound that could end the fight, but a psychological breakdown, because the king understands that even direct pressure no longer guarantees safety, and now every approach carries the risk of an irreversible error. From this point on, Musashi begins to act slightly more aggressively, but not faster. Or rather, he tests the distance with more frequent thrusts, forcing Richard to react, raise his blade, change his stance, and each such response drains energy like an imperceptible tax on the very fact of continuing the fight. The space around them seems to thicken, the fight turning into a series of short episodes where the decisive factor isn't the force of the blow, but the position of the feet, the angle of the shoulders, the direction of the gaze. And here, Musashi's experience of duels, where a mistake equals death, begins to outweigh Richard's experience, accustomed to fighting as a clash of wills and masses. In one exchange, Richard makes a final, serious push, gathering his remaining strength and swinging in a wide, spinning attack, hoping to either finish it all or die. This moment seems truly dangerous because even a tired knight remains deadly strong. However, it is here that Musashi completes what he had been working toward from the start. He doesn't block the blow or retreat, but steps into the void, shifting so that the blade misses, and at the same moment, the katana enters the gap between the guards, a blow not of maximum force, but of perfect direction. And Richard falls not immediately, but to his knee, because his body still tries to continue moving, although the outcome is already decided. Musashi doesn't finish off instantly. He pauses for a split second, assessing whether his opponent can continue. This is not a gesture of mercy, but professional control. But Richard lowers his sword, admitting defeat not with a gesture, but with a fact, because in that moment, he clearly understands that the next exchange will end in death. Musashi's victory doesn't look spectacular or bloody. It looks inevitable, like the logical conclusion of a process in which technique, timing, and spatial control gradually dismantled brute force into its component parts. There is no humiliation in this finale, only a clash of two eras, where one doctrine proved its superiority not with a resounding blow, but with the ability to learn and adapt within the fight, turning every second into a step toward victory.